Thank you so much for having me. That's such a warm welcome. You are the best audience ever. And I will tell you right now, I had someone fall asleep at my presentation on Saturday, so you've already far exceeded them in every sense of the word. And I will tell you, Rose, in my opinion, is a benevolent spirit. So if she does visit us tonight, it will be simply in the name of fun. I can't imagine her doing anything that doesn't involve her being a good egg. So we will see, though, because I will tell you later, there is instances where people think that she has come to them, but it was because they were speaking ill of her. So tonight we're doing a little bit better job. So a little bit about myself, and then we'll tell you more about Rose Veras and the Witch of Delray tale. I am a Metro Detroit journalist. I've been working in this town writing for newspapers and magazines and all sorts of foolishness online like blogs for about the last 20 years. I worked for the Detroit News, where that drive-in book originated when I was freelancing for them. And I covered retail there. And in light of Sears bankruptcy this week, I will tell you that's part of the reason why I ended up freelancing is I covered Kmart, I covered Borders, I covered Jacobson's. And depending on the crowd, no one remembers Jacobson's at all, which is a crying shame. It is a wonderful institution. So I was pretty much out of a job at that point, so I had no choice but to make some different decisions. But I ended up staying at home so I could work, be at home with my kids and still work. And these local history books, the first one being the Ford, Wyoming, fell into my lap very nicely. They contacted me and said, we'd like a book about drive-ins, and this one in particular. And I thought, all right, we'll give it a try. We'll see. I'm going to write a book about a building. I don't know if it can be done, but we'll figure it out. And luckily for us, not only is it a fantastic institution, but the family that founded it is still in Northville area. And then the gentleman who owns it is still kicking, to my knowledge, I think 96 or 97 this past August, if I remember correctly. So he is doing well. The second book I wrote was the potato chip book, as I like to call it, because we all love Better Made, but I am a new era girl. So if anybody remembers those chips from the decades through Detroit from about 1930 forward, I had met a lot of the people who I call chippreneurs through different interviews I'd done. So I wanted to capture that history. I was intrigued with what happened to all the companies and how did Better Made survive. So that led to that wonderful experience of meeting the Cipriano family and being able to tell their tale. And then the third book, kind of a departure, I'll say, nicely for myself. I, to that point, had worked up a bit, I thought, reputation as a bit of a quirky writer. I had written about, again, a drive-in theater, potato chip companies, and I was looking at all sorts of other topics when this one came to me in the form of a story that ran in the Detroit Free Press. So that weekend, a wonderful crime reporter named Lori Brazier, had been assigned the typical Saturday story. When you work Saturdays at a newspaper, you get to cover cat shows, beauty pageants, all method of feature story to fill space. Lori that weekend was the lucky recipient of an assignment to tour Woodmere Cemetery with a hearse club. So a group of owners of hearses that drive them for pleasure, they find them interesting. I've never known anybody to own a hearse, but this was apparently a thing. We're coming into town to meet, and as part of it, they were going to look at Woodmere, arguably one of the largest, if not the largest cemeteries in Detroit and Metro Detroit as a whole. Has anybody been to Woodmere and familiar with it? You can testify on my behalf that if you don't know where you're going, you're not going to get there. It is, I think, 130,000 souls are buried at Woodmere from just probably a good third of Detroit's history. So you've got the Strohs, Strohs might be there. James Werner from that wonderful ginger pop that we so enjoy. I believe the Carhartts are there, the Dodge brothers, the most fantastic two brothers on earth, in my fine opinion. And as the hearse was going through, and these different sites were being pointed out to the hearse owners, one name in particular must have caught Lori's ear. And it was that Rose Veras was buried there. And it was said that as part of running her boarding house in the southwest part of Delray, the southwest part of Detroit, that more than 10 men, in some cases up to 12, had been reportedly killed by her or someone that she was a partner with. And she killed them with carbolic acid was one of the details that was shared that day. But when the article ran, my friend saw it, and he sent me a quick note, and he said, this is your next book. Forget all that other stuff. If there was a female serial killer in Detroit, how come we do not know about her? And then you throw in the magnificence of it being set in 1931 Detroit, a time period that really very little is written about. We do hear about Prohibition, very anecdotally. There's some about the Great Depression, but really there was no like guidepost for me to read to say, this would be fun. I can kind of have this time period. And then I will point out that Rose's birthday is December 26th. So when I went to go find her tombstone, and the second or third time when I finally found it, my birthday is also December 26th. And that just struck me as being far too coincidental. It is an unusual birthday. Everybody comments on it. No, you do not get good gifts. And so I thought, all right, we have a kinship. I need to take on this story. And there's a few blog posts about Rose out there, so I read a little bit enough to be intrigued. But here's our basic facts. And I will tell you, not because of my fine writing, but in general, this is one of the most amazing stories, I think, about the city of Detroit in terms of the people, the events that took place that had to have all these things occur, a lot of so-called coincidences, that without these things happening, Rose and her son would have sat in prison for all of their natural life. And so as a result, I call it the greatest story of my life. So we're going to just get into a fraction of it. And I highly recommend, if you want to buy the books, fantastic. If you want to get them from the library, but to get Rose's whole story and kind of a feel for that era and the people she encountered, we'll talk about a lot of them today, but I encourage you to delve deeper because it really was a lot of fun. But this is our basics. We know that Rose ran a boarding house. She was in her 50s. She had been running this boarding house for arguably, in 1931, at least 5 years, if not longer, probably more like 7 to 10 years. When her husband was alive, he also was a part of that. And that decision was pretty universal across Detroit. If you had rooms to let and you had extra space, you would take in boarders because, again, we're in the Great Depression. If you can get some rent to offset the probably no one in the household having a full-time job, you were going to do it. And there was absolutely, I would argue, no shame to doing it because many of the finest houses in Detroit were boarding houses. Now, Rose at this point in 1931 is running it by herself because her husband has died. And I'll tell you a little bit about him in a moment. He comes into play. But one of the men that is one of her boarders at this time, a gentleman named Steve Mack, he's a Hungarian immigrant that's come to Delray. It is really a kind of a center place for the Hungarian community, to the point where Delray in those decades and that era was known as Hunky Town for the Hungarian population. And he was there like many men. He had come over from Hungary in part because he was a widower and he had 3 daughters. He wanted to send money home to them. And coming to work for one of Detroit's many auto factories or suppliers was much more lucrative. Again, this is Henry Ford's $5 a day era. And it's so tempting because we have the great migration up from the south. You have immigrants pouring into the country post-World War I, and just depending on the turmoil in their own countries, that's how we got the families that founded Better Made to some degree. So he takes up residence in this basement. I won't call it like multiple bedrooms. It's probably just one large space. And in part, Rose is insisting that the men who are living in her boarding house help her out. So that day, there was a broken sash on the window, it's said. And there was kind of a draw straws kind of a thing, and Steve Mack got the short straw, and he was asked to go fix it. And so he goes up a ladder, and we'll see some photos of that area in just a moment, and he's trying to repair this. So then the debate starts here. He's on this ladder. Does he go into the attic and is thrown out? Is he brought up to the attic and thrown out? Whatever happens, does he fall just on his own through pure accident? Whatever happens, that moment becomes the court case that we are here to talk about. But in the meantime, the thing that is without a doubt is Steve falls He sustains many injuries in that fall to the point where 2 days later at Detroit's receiving hospital, he dies. In that time period of those few days in between his fall and his death, there's enough suspicion raised, both by the people that live in Rose's house, the people who know Rose, and her neighbors, who have told the police everything that they think needs to be known about this woman who has been long known in the neighborhood already as the Witch of Delray. The nickname did not arise from this case, it just made this case that much better. Because you can only imagine in a media age like today, but take it back to the 30s when we had 3 full-time newspapers. They had a field day. The headlines for the Witch of Delray were bigger than headlines about FDR, about the Vanderbilts, about Charles Lindbergh. Anyone who was anyone, she could top them, because this case was just too good and really had that kind of like mystery to it. In particular because as the reporters were starting to piece together the story, they put together these wonderful graphics. And I know that one's kind of small, but you can see that it's a list. And the names on the list are all the potential fatalities that took place in Rose's home. And this was probably culled from talking to the neighbors and talking to the police, because they had come to Rose's house before. She had numerous deaths come out of her home over the years she ran the boarding house. And they had come and gone, the police, to see what was going on there, but no arrests, nothing had stuck, so to speak. And even on that list, there's a very familiar name as Gabor Verez. So that would have been Rose's husband. And to have her own husband be one of the suspected, one of the assumed deaths that she had a hand in. Now, some of the things that they list there as the causes of death range from alcoholism to stomach ailments to a suicide by hanging to carbon monoxide poisoning. And that was the case in her husband. Gabor and a friend were repairing a car in the family's garage in a January in Michigan. And they had, my guess, there's no reported stories on it because just a single death in Detroit probably didn't make necessarily headline news, is that they had shut the garage door to maintain some sort of heat, maybe turned on the car and suffocated or had that carbon monoxide poisoning. Now, depending on who you believe though, maybe that garage door got closed by Rose and she led to the death of these 2 men. So this is what was running in the newspaper in the immediate days after her arrest. These were the suspected deaths that she had a hand in, and again, it could number as high as 12. And this is some images that ran in the newspapers of that era. There was the Detroit News, the Detroit Free Press, and the Detroit Times. And very competitive news town, as it was when I worked there, as it probably still is today, but especially then, because the Detroit Times at this point was about a year old. And so they really had a lot to prove. They also had kind of like a wire service, so their stories that ran here in Detroit could run in any newspaper that was part of their network. So news of the Witch of Delray went across the nation. It was so appealing, not only because of the nickname, but because of the number of murders she was going to be accused of at that point. This I love because it does show kind of the scale of the house. They describe it as at about 1.5 stories, and that's because it was an unfinished attic. And you can kind of see the simplicity of the homes and how close they are together. And then that photo on the far right indicates the ladder that Steve Mack would have been on when he fell. And so it gives you some scale that, yeah, I think indeed the injuries he suffered because of his fall were serious enough to cause his death. And he was probably not in great health. He was an older man. I think he was probably already, he was about 155 pounds, not super tall. So I would say maybe a little bit portly, so that his fall might have been because of ill balance. But you can kind of see what that would have looked like. And then, of course, my favorite photo in the middle, the chorus of the neighbors. The neighbors that were always there, keeping an eye on Rose. And I bring up again the Great Depression only in that there's not a lot of people coming and going to their work to keep them busy. It's summertime in Detroit, and these front porches all lined up in that wonderful way that a true neighborhood does, where you can see from one house to another. So they very much would have kept track of each other, and Rose was of a particular interest level. And Detroit, to give you again this idea of what was happening that led to not only this case being prosecuted, but many of the things that probably occurred in Detroit in this time frame. It is a gorgeous city. I mean, it is gorgeous now in my fine opinion, but it is really at arguably its apex in some ways. It has these incredible buildings. The Fisher Building went up in '28. I like to tell people about the decorations alone in the Fisher Building were $25 million. They have like 40 kinds of marble and these elaborate mosaics, and just the amount of handcrafting that went into the Fisher makes it a glorious place to visit any day of the week. You could take any stranger out of any town and land them in the Fisher or the Guardian, and if that doesn't knock their socks off, I don't know what they've seen in their life. You've got the Ambassador Bridge, was brand new. Downtown was booming as a small metropolis. And then things like the Detroit Zoo were being opened. So we had all these wonderful things because we had all these wonderful entrepreneurs who were very successful and spending their money. Like the Fisher brothers wanted a kind of separate downtown away from the core of Detroit. So the New Center became the new downtown. So that was very much a way of showing not only their wealth, but they're returning the favor back to Detroit. Now the population is surging as well. And this is interesting to me because Detroit in the 1800s is a small place. But by the time Rose is living there, it is the 4th largest city in the United States. And it would stay in that place for a long time to come, all the way up into the 1950s, 1960s, when we have the different riots occurring and kind of declines the population to what we know today. But you have, again, the great migration of Southerners coming north to get away from Jim Crow laws and to try to have a better life. You've got immigrants coming from all over Europe and other countries. Delray itself had been, again, largely Hungarian, but you had Armenians, you had Italians, you had African Americans, you had a huge Jewish population. It was its own sort of mosaic of what Detroit was. And then wherein and kind of like what is Delray? Well, part of what I like to tell about it is it was considered in the late 1800s when it was founded as kind of a village neighborhood of its own, not part of Detroit, but really its own place that was settled by a guy named Augustus Barino. It was so beautiful and its location on the riverfront so attractive that there was actually a quasi-World's Fair held there, this exposition. In the late 1890s, was there in a case of kind of like, if anybody's read Devil in the White City by Eric Larson, just this construction of new buildings, interesting things to see. You got kind of like these hot air balloons being taken off, and people came from all over Metro Detroit and Michigan to attend the exposition. And in fact, the land was so beautiful and so wanted that immediately after the exposition was done, a company called Solvay bought it, put up a factory, and started turning Delray into a quasi-factory town. So now they're putting in a hospital and paved roads and street lamps, and housing developments are popping up all around because in this era, before cars in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you walk to work. You might bicycle to work because we were one of the first bicycle towns in the land where really everybody got around through carriages and such. And so all these factories go in right along the river there in Delray because it is this amazing location where you have Zug Island, kind of this unique oasis there, and again, all this access to transport. And Delray, because of its Hungarian population, becomes somewhat of a tourist area. People come in for birthdays to go to one of the Hungarian restaurants and have the gypsies play for them. People come in during the wine festivals when Hungarians are making homemade wine. The beautiful churches to celebrate their religions, terrific downtown areas along Jefferson, along some of the other streets where you could go get baked goods and deli and great fine butchers. Kovacs Bar becomes a mainstay of that area at the time. And one of the people I interviewed for the book actually took part in a beauty queen competition called Miss Delray. I mean, all the way through their different decades of existence, especially after they got annexed into Detroit in 1904. Somewhat against their will, because Delray wanted to stay a village and become its own city, but they always maintained this like otherness. They had a strong culture. They knew who they were. And then, of course, up against all that wealth and all that growth comes the Great Depression, which Detroit had felt somewhat earlier than any other place in the United States, only because, again, our reliance on that single industry, on automotive. So as car sales started to slow down, people held on to their cars a little longer, it's a little more dear to make that big payment. Our depression started, the rest of the nation, of course, followed. Our unemployment rate was usually 10 to 15% higher than the rest of the nation's during this time period. There were the long lines, not only to get a job, but outside soup kitchens. People were being held, or housed inside the Fisher plant at one point, because they needed places for these men and women who weren't working to go, so that they wouldn't be homeless and living on the street. There was, even the mayor had suggested that, again, anyone who didn't have a job go sell apples, and that would be a way to maintain some sort of semblance of normality for people. And there was some different ways that they tried to help people out, but again, most people are not working. And then this thing called Prohibition. Now we're really mixing it up, because Detroit then and Michigan as a whole are among the first to willingly go into Prohibition and say, no, we will not allow for sales of alcohol. Now, you can put that on the books, but in reality, Hamtramck, cities villages and then neighborhoods like Delray become hotbeds for alcohol. I mean, not only are they making their own wine as part of the tradition in Delray, but Delray, and at different points in the Detroit River, the band to go from Detroit to Windsor is so slim that you could easily, and they did, take their cars across. My friend Mickey Lyons, who's a Detroit Prohibition expert, tells wonderful stories about people painting their cars completely white so they can cross the Detroit River undetected. And women having curved alcohol containers that could attach to their legs so that they could cross to Canada, fill up, and then come back. And the Detroit police actually had to activate a female police force, one of the first in the nation, a small group, to search women coming back from Canada, because it wouldn't do to have a male search a woman. So we had some of the first police officers who were female in the nation. Now, 75%, it is said, of the nation's alcohol came in through Detroit. And with that came with it the outgrowth of kind of this lawless group of individuals, your mob, your gangs, anybody who wanted to work around this kind of industry, who were going to then dominate. So we got a few pictures of that on the next page. So if you don't like pictures of mob violence, look away. Oh, my photo disappeared. I will see what happened, because that was the picture. Well, someone must not have liked it. You wished it away. There's Rose messing with us. There's a picture of one of the gang wars, where the outcome of where they just went into a house and basically shot everybody in the entire house. So we had two main gangs in Detroit. We had an Italian gang, and they were kind of part of Al Capone's, not his gang, but that kind of syndicate. Like, they were New York, Chicago, Detroit were kind of the three main gangs in the Midwest. And then we had the Purple Gang, kind of this Jewish group that were known for, at least in lore, for not only running most of the alcohol, but they run houses of prostitution. They run gambling houses, much like the Italian mob. And they worked side by side. They didn't really have too many wars against one another, but within their factions. Many killing sprees, many vengeance killings, so much so that Detroit is now becoming known. Not only, again, are we bringing in the most alcohol in the nation, it's being disseminated from our city. Al Capone's a regular visitor. All these people are making alcohol on the side. Hamtramck has more bars in its 2 square miles than some states did. It becomes so lawless that now the population is starting to feel that pain. At first we're all okay because we're still getting our alcohol, but at some point it becomes so insane. I mean, the equivalent of like a Mitch Albom style radio broadcaster is gunned down in the hotel lobby as he sits reading the newspaper. And it's these kind of high profile deaths that the Italian mob in particular were behind that finally turned the tide of public sentiment against this kind of behavior. Now, at one point, though, our mayor, this guy named Charles Bowles, is more of a fan of his own regime ignoring everything, to the point where he says, well, just let the gangs kill each other. The police, you go about doing your business, I'll continue doing mine. And when he turns a blind eye, so much so to crime, that radio personality I mentioned named Jerry Buckley is killed, finally people start to want to hold the criminal's feet to the fire. And that's how the gentleman there in the lower right-hand corner, and we'll see some better pictures of him later, that's got a bit of the balding front head there, a guy named Harry Toy, gets elected. He is the Wayne County prosecutor for Rose Vera's and her trial. And he is elected more or less on the campaign of, I will clean up this one-horse town, and I will stop this crime from happening. And he does. He actually is able to bring the gentlemen who are accused of Jerry Buckley's killing at least to trial. And it's exhausting. He's fainted in court at one point because he is working so hard. And it is under his direction that the Rose Vera's murder trial begins. And because he's so busy doing other things, being public, talking in front of the media, he's not known as Headline Harry for nothing, that he assigned some other people to take care of the case. And this is pivotal to Rose's situation. She's up against Prohibition, the Great Depression, a city like no other that's growing by leaps and bounds, that is Detroit, and a prosecutor who, bless his heart, he is kind of a good guy, has also said, I need to prosecute everybody. Nobody can get away with anything because that's what I've promised, and that's what I'm going to do. So these are some of the main characters, so to speak, in Rose's case. And to me, this is what was the most fun about writing the book, was discovering who they were, doing the research on each of them, finding out how incredibly fascinating it was, and to wish, if you could have one dinner and invite all of them and let them tell their stories, how amazing would it be? Because you have everything from the lead detective on the homicide squad that oversaw Rose's case to a woman whose suicide leads to the downfall of the entire Detroit government. And that is why Rose, in fact, is able to get her freedom at some point. If not for that suicide, half of the Detroit police force, the mayor, the sheriff, and the Wayne County prosecutor of its time would have all walked away with their pockets lined with bribes from every manner of criminal activity. She called them out. Everybody noticed. They all went to jail. We'll hear more about that soon enough. And then, of course, Rose and her son, Bill, the main so-called characters, but real people who had to go through all of this. So in putting the story together, I had, in my mind, I wanted someone to kind of see the lens of what was happening. And that's where I came to John Whitman. And he was a very high-profile detective in that the media must have loved him, so he's quoted often. They tease him in the newspapers for his gardening. He's a master gardener and he loves flowers. And the irony of a guy whose voice is said to sound like a cement truck as he's talking to the different reporters, giving them good stories of the day, who also gardens, must have just tickled them. So he was a very popular person. And he oversaw Rose's investigation. And I think wanted the best for her in that he is a straight shooter. And at the time, the Detroit police force was riddled with not straight shooters. They were considered, before Harry Toy took over as as prosecutor for Wayne County, the Detroit police force and the sheriff's department were considered some of the worst in the nation as well. There were good people, thankfully, but it still was quite problematic. And then obviously a main character, and I wish we knew more about her, is Rose herself. The Hungarian immigrant that came to the United States in search of an errant husband. He had come to the United States, Martin, her first husband, to make a better life for them. and he was going to get a job here, and he was going to have her come over to the United States, and they would live their lives together. Only it didn't work that way. And she came over to the United States by herself in pursuit of what happened to my husband. And according to legend, indeed found him when she got here to Detroit by hook or by crook. I don't know how she would raise the money or have that kind of self-possession to say, I'm going alone, but she did. And she found him, and he was supposedly living with another woman. And so that's where she divorces him, or something happens. I never could find divorce papers, but I presume that may be the case. She marries Gabor. They have 3 sons, and they're living in a small house in Delray when he dies in 1927. And then the suspicion of her doings with all these different residents of her home, and the neighbors always calling the police every time there was a funeral from her boarding house. Now, the gentleman who lived in her boarding house either set aside the money for the funerals or would occasionally have small insurance policies. Insurance was sold door to door in this era. There were full-page newspaper ads constantly when I was looking up articles about her. If you don't have life insurance, you are leaving your family bereft, and you will, in the case of many of these single men, die a pauper. You will be buried alone and unrecognized. And so this was a very real fear. So a lot of them, including Steve Mack and some of the others, had insurance policies on themselves, small ones, but enough money to bury them, and to bury them with some honor. So she did that. And that, of course, in an era when nobody has anything. They don't have chickens to eat, they don't have sugar to pass between them, they don't have birthday cakes. It's the Great Depression. Anyone spending money is going to get noticed, and she did get noticed. She talked to one reporter, or a few reporters. They kind of made her available in jail to these bizarre first-person interviews done through a translator. And she indicates that. She said, they liked me when my husband was alive, and I could help them. But when I lost him, and he was a good man, all of a sudden I was the witch of Delray. And anything that went wrong in the neighborhood got blamed on her. And that was kind of where she came at it. She didn't speak much English. She didn't need to. Delray was small and insular, and she could get around just fine. Now, her son Bill was 18, so he got tried as an adult alongside her. And again, not much is known about Bill. That's kind of the great crime of this, is we're all average until we're not average. And in this case, they got elevated out of a very normal life into a very scary, probably hard to understand what was happening moment when they were held for this murder of their boarder. But we do know he was 18, and they did charge him such. He was tried alongside his mom. Probably not super tall, because she was about 5'3", so he's probably about 5'7", 5'8", based on this photo, and maybe had one run-in with police, because I found record in some of the newspaper accounts that maybe he shoplifted one time. You know, so he wasn't like an errant teenager, but he was a teenager, and probably not quite sure what was happening as much as any of us would be, I would say. Now, Harry Toy, again, love Harry. He does assign the case, though, to 2 of his assistant prosecutors, because he's busy. He's Wayne County prosecutor, like I mentioned. He's going to clean up Detroit. And so the first one, he says, I'm going to assign Rose Vera's to you. Duncan, you've handled lots of high-profile cases. And indeed, Duncan McCrea had. He had worked his way up from a civil servant, went to school for becoming a lawyer at night, and just pulled himself to the top. And this would have been quite a coup for him to get this high-profile case, because he was looking to run for a judge. One of the judge positions in Detroit was open. What better way to make headlines than to take on this fantastic case that was built-in headline news. And as he was known to his co-workers and the public, Drunken McCrea was always good for a good quote. He was always good for a drink. He was an interesting fellow. The one photo shows him as the prosecutor of the Black Legion. It was kind of like a KKK-esque group here in Detroit. Yet he was also a card-carrying member of the Black Legion. So he was this kind of like shadowy morals kind of guy. He's not a good guy for Rose. He can redeem himself, and he does. We'll find out a little more about that. The other assistant prosecutor on Rose's case is George Stutz. Now, George is the only one who points out at some point in the process, you realize we have no physical evidence that unites these people to the crime. There's only one or two people, and we'll hear their stories in a moment, that even have Rose and Bill on the property when Steve Mack falls. And as he points this out, he's told to hush up, be quiet, do your job, and stay in the background. Which, because he's in his early 20s and new to the office, he does. To his credit, though, he too, and there's lots of examples of how he was sort of a guardian angel to this case over the years, does help, again, bring some justice in the end. But, and again, my favorite thing, again, about doing this book was finding these weird, wonderful people from our collective past and bringing them forward. I fell in love with Vera Brown because she wrote the most interesting articles about the Witch of Delray. The most adjectives, the most outrageous scribe probably of her day. And she had just started at the Detroit Times. They had sort of stolen her away from the Detroit News, where she had been, like many female reporters, put on the woman's page, go write some recipes, dear. That was not who Vera was. And when she got to the Detroit Times, they let her go. Go write what you're gonna write, go do what you're gonna do. They gave her a column. She covered the Detroit Tigers when they won the World Series in the 30s. A woman got to cover the World Series. This should tell you something about Vera Brown. And when she got assigned to cover Henry Ford, who at the time was making airplanes in preparation for World War II, she learned to fly. And she would fly all over Metro Detroit in the Detroit Times airplane. She became so well known, she actually crashed once, and it was front page news, because people were like, well, Vera Brown, that's one of our greatest celebrities. And she worked at the Detroit Times till it closed in 1960. So from 1930, basically, to 1960. She was known for when it was hot, like in this August of 1931. She typed in just her slip, with her little felt hat on and a cigarette dangling out of her mouth as she swore at her editor to give her more time. I mean, how could you not love her? But she did write the most outrageous things and probably did not help Rose's case. But again, this was her chance. This was her way of making her name. And for the grace of God, again, go all of us to get a Vera Brown in our lives. So a little bit about what happened that day. The case, when it came before the courts, the incident happened at the end of August. By the first week of October, they were in court for the trial. All the preliminary hearings, all that stuff's done in September. By October, they're already going to trial for first-degree murder for Rose and Bill. And the people who testified something like this. So in the first instance, there's a gentleman named John Walker who testifies. He had just started renting a portion of Rose's house as one of her tenants, and he had lived there about 3 weeks when Steve fell. And he testifies that Bill and Rose described to him that they had taken Mac into the basement where he lived and beaten him, carried him upstairs to the bathroom where the access panel for the attic was, pushed him up into the access panel, carried his body across the unfinished attic, and shoved him out the window. And as they're describing this to him, both Bill and Rose in the room, they say, and if you tell anybody, that's going to ruin it for us. So if you keep your mouth shut, we'll pay you. We'll give you a portion of the insurance money. And this compelling testimony is what Duncan McCrea focuses his case on, that if you don't believe Duncan and you don't believe the testimony of John Walker, then he's sunk. But luckily for him, I suppose, Duncan McCrea is basically the Jeffrey Feiger of his era. He is interesting, he's fascinating. This jury is made up of stay-at-home moms and just average people who are just delighted to be there. This is the most interesting thing that has ever happened to them. And he's giving them the show of their lives. Now, in some other versions of the case, this is some of the other testimony. You have a former boarder named George Halas. I'm going to massacre every name. He said he was standing on the street in front of the house. He was coming to visit one of Rose's boarders, and he heard arguing from the attic and then saw Rose push Mac from the window. Now, in another version, a neighbor from across the street said she saw Mac fall. You know, there was a toolbox that he had up there because he was going to do some repairs. And then Rose came over to her house immediately after and asked, you know, I'm covered in the cobwebs and dirt from my attic where I just basically pushed this guy to his death. May I come wash my face in your sink? Because that's what I like to do. After I've committed first-degree murder, I go to my neighbor's house. And again, maybe she's trying to find an alibi of where she was. So Bessie Hill's testimony was damning. And then in the final version, and this kind of closed Duncan McCrea's case, and I can only imagine, again, if you had a courtroom camera to capture this, but again, all your illustrators also do a fine job. A young girl, about 11 years old, was across the street making mud pies, they said, and she saw Mac go up the ladder, go into the attic, but then come out. And to such a degree, it described it as almost like a violent force sent him out. Now, some of her testimony actually contradicts other people's, but this 11-year-old little girl in her little probably bobby socks and cute little coat, it was very compelling testimony, once again, to a lot of women on the jury. Now, Rose and Bill are indeed found guilty, and they are sentenced to life in prison. It's first-degree murder in Michigan. We don't have the death penalty at this time, but they're sentenced to life in prison. So Rose goes to the Women's House of Correction. Her son, Bill, goes to Jackson State Prison in Jackson. And there they sit for the next decade until some very important things happen. And the reason I show these images is because if this hadn't happened, they surely would have lived out their days, their whole natural lives, likely, because they didn't have the money to hire a good attorney. In fact, Rose's attorney was probably arguably the worst attorney in Detroit. He's disbarred shortly after her case. He's a laughingstock in Detroit legal circles because he had a kegger for a jury that ruled in his favor, like invited the jury over for beer. And he's constantly up for ethics violations. But this is her lawyer. This is not a time when you are assigned a wonderful defense attorney. You have to take what you get. Now, in the intervening years, though, Duncan McCrea goes from assistant prosecutor to Wayne County prosecutor. Harry Toy, bless his soul, serves the Michigan Supreme Court. There's an opening. Duncan, the ultimate schemer and power-hungry guy that he is, runs for prosecutor for Wayne County. And the Detroit Free Press actually runs an editorial that says, if you like crime, you will vote for Duncan McCrea. If you want our city to be an open sewer, basically, you will vote for Duncan McCrea. So what does the city of Detroit do? Voted for Duncan McCrea by a landslide. He is voted into office and he starts taking bribes the day he steps foot into the prosecutor's office. Now, it takes a long time to be caught, but one day, one of the little underlings who moves money around the gambling houses decides to break up with his girlfriend. He doesn't do it in a nice way. But the problem was he broke up with Janet McDonald. And Janet McDonald has been described with some very colorful words in other books about Detroit, including some fiction books that include her. And so I like to think of her as just a very fiery Irish woman. And when she decided she was going to end her life, she wrote a series of letters that named everybody. More than 125 people were taken down. The mayor of Detroit, the sheriff, over 100 police officers. I've actually met some people who say that my grandfather was one of those police officers that lost his job because of it. It's amazing that the connections we all have, so to speak. And the Wayne County prosecutor, Duncan McCrea himself, who was the head of it, who basically was such a bad apple, a bad character, that everybody started copying what he was doing, and that's why it was so pervasive. Everybody thinks Kwame Kilpatrick is the biggest political scandal to ever hit Detroit. Nah. Kwame was big, and he had beautiful earrings, giant diamond solitaires. He had nothing on Duncan McCrea. Duncan took down, again, over 125 people with him, so to speak. Now, he held out the longest. He's a lawyer. He was able to kind of fend off the charges. But what he couldn't fend off, though, and the reason we have a picture of a strange hat hanging on the wall, is he couldn't fend off everything. So eventually it caught up with him. As they went to arrest him inside the Wayne County prosecutor's office, the police are coming to arrest the defender of the innocent. He left so quickly that he left his hat behind. And I'll tell you, up until when this book was published, and I assume it's still there, that hat, Duncan McCrea's hat, from basically 1940s, still hangs in the Wayne County prosecutor's office. And it's right outside Kim Worthy's office. The same woman who has hired an attorney to review cases to make sure they have not incorrectly tried and convicted an innocent person. And the same woman who is going and testing all those rape kits that got left behind has this hat, kind of like a bellwether of what the prosecutor should never do, right outside her office. Now this card here is also when he went to Jackson State Prison and Duncan was put in jail, Duncan Cameron McCrea. But one of the first things he decided to do is he was going to right a wrong. That's how I like to see it. I'm going to guess he had maybe some other motives, because he is Duncan. But one of the first things he did, probably within weeks of going to Jackson State Prison, is he went and found Bill Veras. And he told him, you might want to think about getting a new lawyer and reopening this case of you and your mom. I'm just saying. I think he redeemed himself. Now Gabriel, or Gabor Jr., was Rose's middle son. He and his younger brother John had more than likely moved from relative to relative after his mom and brother are sent to prison for life. And he comes of age, and this is always on his mind. At this point, his brother has been in jail for about 13 years. His mother's been in jail for another 1 at least. When he finds, or somehow hears about, and I wish I knew that story, this woman attorney, this female attorney, this lovely woman named Alean B. Clutts. Now that's a name you'll never forget. She is hired, and I'm going to guess probably gets paid, I don't know, maybe in chickens. I don't know what they pay her. But she takes on the case because Alean Clutts is the patron saint of hard luck legal cases in Detroit. If you got improperly institutionalized in the Northville Mental Hospital, you contacted Alean. If you were arrested improperly and you can prove that your case was improperly handled by the Detroit police, you contacted Alean. She got more people new trials and exonerations probably than anybody else in this entire city. And somehow the Veras family found her. And what makes me so honored to write about her, this wonderful native of Port Huron by way of Detroit, who had her own legal firm for like 30 years in the city. And sorry, the photo's so grainy, I stole it out of a newspaper, is when she was married to that fine-looking gentleman there, he decided that hitting her was pretty okay, and that was going to be part of their relationship, and Alean said, I don't think so, and divorced him in 1925, went to law school, got her law degree, and then, like I said, opened her own shingle, and just served her days, helping women and children in particular. Those were her favorites. She would help anybody, and she did. There was prisoners who saved their cigarette money for months to write her a letter in hopes she would take on their case. But she heard about Rose, and she said, I'll do it. I'll figure it out. Anywhere there was a sense of injustice, Alean would be there. And actually, this photo here on the right is the case she took after Rose. When she got Rose free, through a series of an impressive, amazing legal maneuverings, which I would love to tell you all about, but I know you actually want to go home tonight. She took on another case that happened in Michigan of a woman who was held for 26 years for her husband's murder. They said, in fact, in a jealous rage, her first husband's family said she killed him. He used to gargle with mercury-based mouthwash, and he died of mercury poisoning. She quickly remarried, and his family, her first husband's family, was so incensed that they insisted he be exhumed. They found he died of mercury poisoning. They charged her with murder, and they put her in jail for life. And sure enough, Alean reconstructed the case, demanded her freedom, and when the governor of Michigan said, I'll give her freedom, but she's just got to say that, it was some trivial thing, that she had to somehow admit to some part of it, Alean said, no, you will write her a complete exoneration. And he did. So she was found after 26 years in prison, free. And her husband, who's actually the bald-headed fellow there talking to Alean, who had written her every week of those 26 years, was there waiting to pick her up when she was freed. So that's Alean. She's kind of my favorite girl. So the full details are in the book. You got to read the book. If you don't want to read the book, go to the Archives of Michigan, look up all the court documents. I highly recommend it. Alean's incensed handwriting all over the court documents are almost worth their weight in gold. When she like circles things and writes question marks and angry exclamation points, it was quite a thrill to actually backtrack and see how she put the case together to exonerate Bill and Rose when they're freed. They do move out of Delray, the whole family. They go to Melvindale, they settle there, they try to have a normal life. But I will tell you, every year, practically, a newspaper, usually the Free Press of the News, would dredge the case up. So like a judge would retire, and he was one of the judges in her case, they'd write an article. What was your most famous case that you adjudicated or whatever? And he'd say, well, remember the Witch of Delray? And they'd drag it through the newspaper again. So she really had to live with that for the remainder of her days. But she did attempt, at least at one point, to become a US citizen, which I find fascinating. And I tried so hard to see if she ever made it through that process, because here's the country that tried and convicted her, and she spent those years in prison, and yet she did love it enough that she was going to become a US citizen. I'm probably on some watch list somewhere because I wrote to the State Department so many times trying to figure out whether she actually did it. But Delray today, long after the Vera's family left, they did visit. I have lots of tales of people who grew up in Delray that tell me, they met her, they'd see her sitting in, their auntie or grandma's parlor. So they knew who the Witch of Delray was, because that nickname lived on forever. She was the boogeyman of that neighborhood, even today. But Delray is far different, and there's still a lot of pride in it, even though the biggest thing that's coming, and this is the best picture I could find that really shows what's happening, the Gordie Howe International Span that Canada and the United States are building together is going in basically over Delray. I would say in Delray, but when you completely steamroll a community, you're kind of going over it, in my fine opinion. So you can see Fort Wayne, a little inset there, but Fort Wayne is still very much part of Delray, and that's probably one of its best landmarks. But the bridge construction has taken out a lot of the housing and a lot of the landmarks that used to be there. So it'd be a very different place. But a lot of residents still remain. A lot of people who are expats, so to speak, of Delray, very proud of being from there. They have a wonderful community center, and that's one of the murals that's there. Beautiful muralist, who I think is local here, created it. And it tells the whole history of Delray, from the Exposition to Solvay to the growth that it saw over the decades. Unfortunately, in Detroit's efforts for urban renewal, Delray became more or less the dumping grounds for both things that no one else wanted, like the wastewater treatment plant, to the I-75 extension, went through Delray and basically cut it off from the rest of the city. And then there's a lot of brownfields and areas that need remediation. I will add that, though, with the Gordie Howe Bridge, there will be some improvements made, as well as the riverfront is coming from the downtown area. They are planning on redeveloping parks in Delray and Southwest. So like all these beautiful places that are being built, like even today, the $100 million that was announced, the endowment that's going to go to the riverfront to build this incredible park. They have said, and I've asked the guy who runs the Conservancy just socially when I saw him at an event, like, are you coming this far? And he says, absolutely. So they're slowly piecing it together. So even though Delray was its unique neighborhood, much like a Boston Edison or Indian Village or Corktown or all these wonderful names that everybody now knows about Detroit, Delray deserved better. It didn't get it, but it will have some legacy, and it will still be a place probably we'll all visit. Just be a very different sort of thing. And I had to show this photo. This is what I was adding really quick, because I saw this on Facebook the other day, and I was like, I got to get that in there. The photo below is the same place as the photo above. So that's, again, the devastation that has taken place, not only with Detroit's downfall. It's not all the Gordie Howe Bridge, but the Gordie Howe Bridge certainly sped that part along. So a lot of the buildings have been torn down. The magnificent place that, like, Rose would have known the lower photo. That's what she would have grown up and like kind of lived around, so to speak, whereas that's what it looks like today. And someone posted that, and I was just like, that is a crying shame. And so I leave you with this. I leave you with how I like you to remember Rose, or how I would choose if you take my advice to remember Rose. This is her with her grandson when she got released from prison in 1945, thanks to Alean Clutts. It took a lot of legal maneuvering to get her there, but she was found innocent by a jury of her peers. And the reason I bring that up is any reference you see to the Witch of Delray, including, she was in Our Detroit earlier this year. They had done a beautiful cover story, Detroit from A to Z. And sure enough, I knew it. There she is in the article, and she's described as a serial killer who killed up to 12 men. And I'm like, you can't write that anymore. You can't. You cannot say that, because you got to at least put accused. You got to at least give her that. And then in 1945, she was found innocent of that same crime. Because, and I think, what if it was my grandmother? What if it was my mother? What if it was my sister? What if it's my mom? You know, like, what if this person is my person? And Rose is now my person? So I wrote a very long series of angry letters and phone calls and tweets and everything else you can think of to Our Detroit. And I said, you can't say that anymore. So they put in this little sad little correction. But at least it made the point that do your fact checking and say the right thing. Because if any of us get accused of a crime and are found innocent, I'd like to think that part about being innocent would be highlighted. But like I mentioned, she's still the boogeyman somewhat of that area. The far right photo is from a bar in Detroit. They have a drink. I don't know if they did it this Halloween. I'll have to check their website or go have a drink there. If they do it again this year, they have a drink called the Witch of Delray, for example. And I wonder what whip smart bartender, hipster came up with that name, and do they know the whole story? Because if they don't, I think I need a free drink, so we'll see. But I will tell you that was one of my fun stories of writing about Rose and telling what I think is her more complete story. Is a friend of mine does the bus tours in Detroit. There's so many haunted Detroit tours and paranormal expert tours. It's ridiculous. They all include Rose. They like to tell the story they want to tell. She does everything from axe murder to cut people up and put them in meat pies. I actually heard that one on a tour and took them to task for that. And then my friend was going to do a tour, and she goes, okay, I'm going to buy you lunch. You're going to tell me Rose's whole story, and then I'll add it to the tour. And I was like, oh, fantastic. So I give basically the same speech we had here today and said, this is why you've got to tell everybody that you know, she was exonerated, though. She was accused of these one murder, not 12, one. There was no other trials ever for any of the other boarders. They didn't even the ones they mentioned there, the suicide by hanging, her husband, the people who died of alcoholism, none of those ever went to trial. Just this one, Steve Mack. And alcoholism, I have to ask, what were they drinking if it was Prohibition that they ended their lives in that way? And she said that the first night she did the tour after talking to me, she told it my way, but it was a little boring. She admitted it. She sent me a note. She's like, it didn't go over well. You know, no one really wants to hear that part. So the next night she said, though, she went back to the original story of, you know, Rose is the boogeyman and she killed people and she could be haunting us right now. And she said, a tree limb scratched along the bus windows. And she kind of looked around and she's like, I think Rose is talking to us. And the rest of the bus was like, I think so too. And it was like, okay, we're going to leave that out from now on. And I'm like, see, she's a benevolent spirit. She just wants to make sure the story is told and maybe told correctly, so to speak. So that is my version of the Witch of Delray. Again, I invite you to look online. If you can't sleep some night, there's some wonderfully, hilariously, in my opinion, written blog posts about her where they say she can shapeshift and she can turn herself into a wolf and all sorts of fun things. So I'm here to take all those to task a little bit. But this is all true stories and, again, true history of our fair city. And all these wonderful characters lived and existed here, and aren't we the better for it, so to speak?
I would like to think Kim Worthy would, when she's feeling particularly righteous, could put on Duncan McCrea's hat and do some good deeds. So thank you so much for your time. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.